Have you ever wondered why, in the midst of the information age, one of the largest and oldest libraries in the world remains shrouded in almost impenetrable secrets? Why are there rooms that not even some popes dared to explore? The Vatican Apostolic Library is a fortress of silence built over centuries, guarding not only religious manuscripts, but documents that could completely change the way we understand the past, faith, and especially the figure of Jesus Christ. Imagine an archive with over 80,000 rare volumes, many of which have never been seen by public eyes, not cataloged, not digitized, just watched. This raises a baffling question. What is there that needs to be so carefully hidden? And more importantly, why? The Vatican has never made a secret of the library's existence, but rather of its content. Officially founded in 1475, its origin traces back to collections that had been accumulating for centuries, even since the time of the first Christian emperors. And over time, what was a simple collection of religious texts transformed into a true vault of knowledge, where words hold more power than weapons. We're not just talking about theology. We're talking about ancient maps that redraw the history of humanity, about letters exchanged between spiritual leaders and emperors, about manuscripts that shed light on historical figures from a new perspective, and that could, if revealed, provoke earthquakes in the structure of what we know as traditional Christianity. The Church itself admits that only a fraction of this collection has been studied, and an even smaller fraction has been made available to the public. This is not by chance, it's method. For many, control over the historical narrative is the most sophisticated form of power. After all, whoever controls the past shapes the present and defines the future. In this millennia-old game of influence, the Vatican Library operates as the hidden heart of a spiritual and political empire, the institution that has most influenced Western civilization over the last 2 millennia guards its most sensitive jewel behind gates that do not open with a key, but with papal authorization. Scholars who gain access face a rigorous bureaucratic process, need to prove academic intentions, and are watched the entire time. No material can be taken out, no photographs are allowed, and study time is strictly limited. What is the fear? The most intriguing part is that the very existence of the library defies the basic principle of Christianity: universal access to truth. If the truth sets you free, as Jesus said, why keep it locked away? Many believe that there are documents there that show a different side of the Messiah, revealing aspects of his life that were not included in the canonical Gospels. Letters, accounts, testimonies of people who lived in his time, but whose versions of the story were considered too dangerous to be disclosed. The question is not whether such documents exist, it's why we are not allowed to see them. There is also the role of the Vatican's own librarians, a discreet and highly trained intellectual caste whose mission goes beyond organization and cataloging. They are, in a way, the guardians of a treasure trove of knowledge that could shake dogmas ingrained for centuries. Not a single leaf moves without their knowledge, and many of them work entire decades without ever gaining access to the most restricted sections. Everything operates in compartments, like a puzzle that only makes sense to those who built it. This architecture of secrecy is not merely organizational, it is symbolic. The secret rooms, known as archives, are different from the open library. They are protected by enhanced security, with sensors, surveillance systems, and encrypted access. Encoded documents, texts in dead languages, records indecipherable to most. And even among those who master these codes, few can accurately translate what they find there. There are records of texts that have been deliberately disfigured, fragmented, or translated in a skewed manner. A subtle but effective strategy to maintain control of the content without destroying it. After all, sometimes keeping the secret is more powerful than erasing it. Some scholars suggest that the most controversial manuscripts are kept in underground vaults in sections of the library that are not listed on any official map. These areas would be reserved for documents classified as of pontifical interest, a vague term that could include anything from correspondences of saints to writings considered heretical. In 1940, during the Second World War, part of this material was removed and protected in even more secretive locations, far from the reach of invading forces or spies. Since then, many of these boxes have never been opened again, and what has been lost, no one really knows. And here comes a crucial point: the manipulation of time. By keeping documents hidden for centuries, the Vatican transforms knowledge into legend, and legend into superstition. What could be a historical revelation becomes mere speculation. The absence of documentary evidence plays in favor of the institution, as it allows it to drive the narrative to its advantage. In this process, what is excluded becomes invisible, and the invisible becomes irrelevant, at least in the eyes of common society. The library then becomes not just a vault, but a filter of realities. The strategy of omitting rather than destroying is far more efficient. Destroying documents raises alarms, but hiding, archiving, locking away, this only generates doubts, and doubts are easy to discredit. And that's where the genius, or the danger, of the Vatican Library lies. It preserves information while preventing its circulation. And in this contradiction, it feeds both faith and skepticism. The believer thinks everything there serves the divine. The skeptic suspects that the divine is just a mask for control. Both are partly right, but neither of them have the full evidence, and that's exactly what keeps the system in balance. In recent years, some attempts at digitization have been announced, but with extremely limited access. Only a few thousand documents have been released, a drop in the ocean compared to the colossal collection. And yet, these few files have already raised questions about biblical passages, historical accounts, and even the chronology of Jesus' life. If so little already causes so much noise, imagine the impact of a full disclosure. Is the world ready for this truth, or is it precisely the fear of global reaction that prevents this revelation? The Vatican, despite modern pressures, maintains its stance with unshakable serenity. It knows that well-kept secrets are more powerful than any speech, that revealed truth can liberate, but it can also destroy entire systems of beliefs. The mystery, therefore, is not an accident. It's a choice. And perhaps the biggest sign that there is indeed something there that could rewrite the history of Jesus, and with it, everything we think we know about faith, spirituality, and the true purpose of our existence. For centuries, Christianity has been shaped from a very specific set of texts, carefully selected, organized, and disseminated by religious authorities who decided what should be accepted as truth and what should be rejected, silenced, or simply erased. What few know is that there are dozens of other gospels, letters, and accounts that were deliberately excluded from the official version of the Bible. These documents, known as apocryphal or Gnostic, have not completely disappeared. Many of them were hidden, secretly copied by monks, preserved in caves, or buried in ceramic jars, and some ended up under the dominion of the Vatican Library, where they remain locked up. Their content not only offers alternative views of Jesus, but also reveals a spirituality much deeper, symbolic, and introspective than that presented by the canonical scriptures. They are echoes of an ancient truth, a wisdom that was stifled by fear of the unknown. Among these manuscripts, we find the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus that is not based on miracles or narratives, but on pure wisdom, words that seem to resonate with Eastern traditions and esoteric principles. This text does not speak of crucifixion or resurrection. It speaks of self-knowledge, of inner light, of a truth that does not depend on temples, priests, or intermediaries. This type of teaching directly threatened the power structure of the nascent church, which needed a clear hierarchy, solid dogmas, and a well-defined command center. To reveal that the kingdom of God is within you, as Thomas asserts, was the same as saying that no one needed the church to access the divine. This was unacceptable. Another powerful document is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, found in fragments and kept secret for a long time. In it, Mary is not portrayed as the repentant prostitute that tradition has built, but as one of Jesus' closest disciples, perhaps even the wisest, the one who understood the hidden mysteries most deeply. There are passages where the apostles themselves, like Peter, express jealousy and insecurity in the face of her wisdom. This feminine, spiritual, and intuitive narrative breaks with the patriarchal molds that have dominated the Christian religion for almost 2,000 years. Accepting this gospel would mean rewriting the role of women in the history of faith, something that the ecclesiastical structure has never been willing to do. During the Council of Nicaea, in the year 325 AD, A selection was made to define which books would form the basis of the New Testament. This decision was not purely spiritual, it was political. Emperor Constantine wanted to unify his empire under a common faith, and for that, it was necessary to eliminate disagreements, erase contradictions, and present a cohesive, albeit artificial, narrative. Gospels that portrayed a Jesus who was too human or too spiritual or contradictory were discarded. Others were literally destroyed, but some survived, and many of them today are precisely in the vaults of the Vatican Library. In addition to the Gospels, there are manuscripts that expand the vision of early Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, found in Qumran, brought to light texts from the Essenes sect, a mystical group that possibly influenced Jesus himself. Although these documents are outside the Vatican, many scholars believe that copies and commentaries on them have also been archived in the library. Even more intriguing is the discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in Egypt in 1945. This collection features books that delve deeply into Gnostic philosophy, revealing a version of Christianity based on inner mysteries, soul journeys, and symbolism that echo traditions such as Hermetism and Neoplatonism. Among these texts is the Gospel of Judas, which presents an enigmatic Jesus and a Judas who is not a traitor, but the fulfiller of a sacred mission. He would have been instructed by Jesus to hand him over so that a larger plan could be realized. This role reversal completely alters the theology of sacrifice and guilt, central pillars of traditional Christianity, and even with the modern publication of this gospel, little is spoken about it in religious circles. Coincidence? Hardly. The content is, at the very least, explosive, and the Vatican certainly has more versions and documents related to this view. The library also houses extremely rare translations of Ethiopian and Coptic texts, languages that preserve spiritual nuances lost in the Latin and Greek versions. In some of these manuscripts, we find passages where Jesus teaches meditation techniques, talks about reincarnation, or describes altered states of consciousness as part of the spiritual path. None of this is mentioned in the accepted Gospels. The Church's silence on these topics is not just doctrinal, it's strategic. If these practices are recognized as part of the original teaching, it opens up a path to a much broader spirituality, less dependent on religious institutions. There are also documents that deal with the childhood and youth of Jesus, periods widely ignored by the traditional Gospels. Some accounts speak of travels, of spiritual masters who instructed him in the desert, of contacts with Eastern cultures. Others describe mystical episodes involving visions, healings, and demonstrations of power even in his childhood. The omission of these accounts reinforces the narrative of a Messiah who only manifests at the age of 30, without a past, without reference, almost like a mythological character. Reintegrating these passages into the story would require reviewing everything, from the origin to the mission of Christ. And why were these documents considered dangerous? Because they liberate. Because they invite the human being to search for themselves, to think, to question, to live spirituality as a personal experience and not as a mandatory doctrine. The Church, for a long time, functioned as a mandatory bridge between God and man. These texts break this bridge. They show that the divine is accessible to everyone, at all times, in all places. And this, for a spiritual empire, is simply intolerable. It's important to understand that censorship has never been solely destructive. Often, it was silent. Instead of burning books, they were hidden. Instead of denying, interpretations were distorted. Instead of erasing, symbols were replaced. The result of this is that today we have an incomplete and often distorted view of original Christianity. The Vatican Library, by preserving these documents, becomes both an accomplice and a guardian of knowledge that could transform faith into something much more vibrant, profound, and liberating. Revealing these manuscripts to the public would mean, above all, returning to the world the plurality of ideas that existed in the early centuries of the Christian era. It would mean showing that Christianity was not born as one, but as many, that Jesus was interpreted in different ways by different people, and that all these views have something to teach us. But by allowing this access, the Church would lose its monopoly on interpretation. And perhaps this is the greatest fear of all. Because once people have direct access to the truth, there is no longer any way to control them. And so, the manuscripts remain where they are, silent, locked away, invisible to the public eye. But not dead. They still live. They live in the memory of a few scholars, in the hidden copies, in the fragments that escaped. They live in the intuition of those who feel there is something beyond what we have been told. And perhaps, just perhaps, they are waiting for the right moment to emerge and show the world that the truth, no matter how dormant it may be, never ceases to breathe beneath the surface of silence. If the story of Jesus told in the canonical Gospels was complete, why would there be so many records scattered around the world mentioning his presence in places that, officially, he never visited? Why are there reports, manuscripts, legends, and traditions preserved by cultures that have no direct connection with Roman Christianity, but describe a master of wisdom, a man of light, known by various names, who walked among them centuries ago? This question, although uncomfortable for many, opens the doors to one of the most controversial and fascinating topics of the Vatican's hidden collection: the intercultural records that connect Jesus to regions such as Tibet, India, Egypt, and even territories of ancient Mesopotamia, documents that may be as old as the Gospels but that were quietly discredited or relegated to the field of curiosity. What would happen if they were taken seriously? And if these records showed that Jesus not only existed beyond Palestine, but that there he studied, taught, and was recognized as one of the great spiritual avatars of humanity? One of the most intriguing examples is the manuscript found in the Himas Monastery in northern India, more specifically in the Kashmir region. Referred to by some as the Gospel of Issa, this text describes the journey of a young wise man from the West named Issa, a name very close to the term that Islam uses to refer to Jesus. The manuscript asserts that Issa lived among the Brahmins and Buddhist monks, where he learned about meditation, healing, and detachment from worldly things. He is said to have challenged castes, preached equality, and then returned to his people to teach what he had learned. This story directly contradicts the gap present in the Gospels between Jesus' ages of 12 and 30, a period mysteriously absent from the official narrative. How is it possible that the central character of an entire religion has almost 2 decades of his life simply ignored? And why does a manuscript with such specific accounts remain outside of popular knowledge? In addition to Himas's text, there are also traditions preserved by ancient Tibetan records that mention a man of fair skin, bright eyes, and serene speech who came from the West and taught the way of truth. These writings do not use the name Jesus, but the descriptions coincide surprisingly with what we know about him. In some versions, he is called Asaf, and his presence is recorded on ancient maps, in oral legends, and in remote temples. There are even graves attributed to him, such as the famous Rosabal tomb in Srinagar, that spark controversies and intense debates. All of this is ignored by major theological centers, and any attempt to validate such information is treated as heresy. The Vatican not only knows about these reports, but also has its own records about them, documents that confirm investigations carried out by missionaries, explorers, and Catholic scholars over the centuries. But these investigations were closed, often abruptly, and the reports archived without any public disclosure. In Egypt, we find ancient papyri preserved among the ruins of burnt libraries that mention figures similar to Jesus coexisting with initiated priests. The connection with the Essenes, a mystical group with practices similar to Egyptian and Eastern ones, also strengthens the idea that the historical Christ did not emerge in a vacuum, but rather within a much broader and more diverse spiritual melting pot than one might imagine. There are fragments that speak of initiations, energy healing ceremonies, matter manipulation, and even projections of consciousness, all elements foreign to dogmatic Christianity, but common to Hermetic and alchemical traditions. These records, which could bring religions closer together instead of separating them, have been banished from the Western narrative, and the reason is simple. If Jesus was initiated by previous cultures, then the monopoly of divine revelation falls to the ground. The Islamic tradition also offers an alternative version of Jesus called Issa, revered as a prophet and not as the exclusive Son of God. In the Quran, there are passages that coincide with events from the Gospels, but there are also striking differences. For example, the denial of Jesus' crucifixion and death. According to the Islamic view, he would have been elevated to heaven without dying and will return at the end of times. This narrative has parallels in ancient Persian texts, which speak of a master sent by the light, rejected by the powerful, but kept by the heavens for a future return. Some of these records are found in ancient languages, such as Pahlavi and Avestan, and some scholars claim that copies were brought to the Vatican during diplomatic missions. Once again, silence. No official refutation, just purposeful oblivion. There are also accounts from late Mesopotamian civilizations, already influenced by contact with Jews and Romans, that document the visit of a holy man coming from the Mediterranean Sea, who healed, taught, and spoke in parables. These records are partially destroyed, but the chronology fits with the period between Jesus' childhood and adulthood. If validated, they would represent a shift in the geographical axis of the Christian narrative. The Messiah would not only be Jewish, but universal. Someone who traversed various cultures, absorbed ancient knowledge, and synthesized all of this into his own mission. This view is reinforced by inscriptions found on ancient trade routes between the Middle East and India, suggesting that teachers and healers frequently traveled in search of wisdom. Could Jesus have been one of them? And it doesn't stop there. Some shamanic traditions from the Americas speak of a white prophet coming from the East, with healing powers and messages of peace. Mayan and Quechua legends, long before the arrival of the colonizers, already described beings of light who came to teach and then disappeared. Of course, all of this can be interpreted as coincidence or as mythological symbolism. But when these stories converge in patterns, in similar messages, in images that echo the same archetype, doubt imposes itself. Why do so many distant and isolated cultures describe in different ways someone with characteristics identical to those of Jesus? These accounts have been studied by Jesuit, Franciscan, Dominican, and exploring monks over the centuries. Many of them wrote diaries, collected accounts, copied inscriptions, and sent everything to the Vatican. These materials were recorded, numbered, filed, and forgotten. They never reached public knowledge. When questioned, church representatives claim that such documents have not been verified or do not have doctrinal relevance. But this stance raises another question. What if the problem is not veracity but implication? To accept that Jesus traveled, learned, and sowed seeds in other traditions means accepting that Christianity is just one of the manifestations of his legacy. And this would put dogma into question. Spirituality would become something universal, free, multi-form. Temples would lose their exclusivity. Religions would have to engage in dialogue. And perhaps, precisely for this reason, knowledge remains hidden. The Vatican Library is not just a repository of texts. It is a fortress of control, a shield against a truth that, if revealed, would dissolve the borders between faith and ancestral wisdom. What is at stake fundamentally is not just the story of one man. It is the origin of a spiritual consciousness that transcends religions, cultures, languages, and borders. Jesus, the man, may have been much more than what the Gospels tell. And Jesus, the symbol, may be more alive in the forgotten corners of the planet than on the golden altars of the cathedrals. The complete truth is still buried under layers of silence, and the Vatican, with all its resources, holds the keys. But like every buried seed, one day it sprouts. And when that happens, the world will not only see a new Christ, it will see a new understanding of itself. For centuries, the figure of Mary Magdalene has been reduced to a stigma: the forgiven prostitute, the redeemed sinner, the woman who wept at Jesus' feet. This image, repeated countless times in sermons, paintings, and catechesis, hides something much deeper and more threatening to the foundations of Christian tradition. For Mary Magdalene was not merely a supporting player in the Messiah's story. Ancient documents, suppressed and hidden, show that she was, in fact, one of Jesus' closest disciples, and perhaps the most enlightened of all. The Vatican knows this. Since the 2nd century, there are records of Gospels that exalt her role as a spiritual leader, as a direct advisor to the Master, as the one who understood the highest teachings. But this narrative was intentionally erased. And the question that echoes is simple and devastating. What did the Church fear so much in acknowledging the true role of Mary Magdalene? The so-called Gospel of Mary, a Gnostic manuscript found in Egypt in 1896 and kept out of the public eye for decades, presents a Mary Magdalene who not only dialogues with the apostles, but confronts them. In this work, after the death of Jesus, she consoles the disciples, shares spiritual visions received directly from the Master, and exposes teachings that no other disciple seems to understand. Peter, the same Peter who would later become a symbol of the Church's foundation, expresses jealousy and suspicion, questioning why Jesus would have entrusted her with such secrets. Mary responds with serenity, demonstrating spiritual confidence and authority. This narrative completely diverges from the submissive and sinful image that was attributed to her by ecclesiastical tradition. If she really was the most direct channel of mystical wisdom with Christ, then the entire apostolic hierarchy needs to be rethought, and with it, the foundation of the religious structure that succeeded it. During the first centuries of Christianity, there were communities that revered Mary Magdalene as the apostle of the apostles. She was considered an initiate, a teacher, a woman of authentic spiritual power. There are documents suggesting that she performed healing rituals, symbolic baptisms, and profound spiritual guidance. Some of these records were confiscated during the Roman persecutions, and others were hidden by monks who feared the complete destruction of this knowledge. The Vatican, with its network for collecting and preserving manuscripts, has copies of these texts, but has never released them. The reason is clear: acknowledging the centrality of Mary Magdalene means rehabilitating the sacred feminine, admitting that the original spirituality was not exclusively masculine, and that the first followers of Jesus lived in a much more egalitarian reality than the one imposed by later councils. Art also bears signs of this manipulation. Renaissance paintings, such as those by Leonardo da Vinci, conceal symbolisms that challenge the official narrative. In the famous mural of the Last Supper, for example, there is a character next to Jesus that many believe to be Mary Magdalene, not John, as traditionally taught. The figure has feminine features, a gentle posture, and a visual connection with Christ that no other disciple expresses in the work. This detail, analyzed by scholars and theologians not aligned with the Vatican, suggests that Renaissance artists were aware of hidden knowledge and tried, through art, to preserve what the texts could no longer publicly proclaim. But perhaps the most explosive point in this story is the theory of the Holy Grail. Far beyond the idea of a physical chalice used by Jesus at the Last Supper, the Grail, according to occult traditions and apocryphal texts, would represent the sacred womb of Mary Magdalene, the receptacle of Christ's spiritual and biological lineage. Some esoteric currents maintain that she was not only a disciple, but Jesus' wife, and that she bore offspring. This lineage, in turn, would have been secretly protected, migrating to Europe and founding royal lines with a spiritual mission. This theme, although it may seem like fiction to some, finds support in ancient documents, secret genealogies, hidden symbols, and, above all, in the fear it arouses in the clerical structure whenever it is mentioned. The Vatican keeps files with investigations into this possibility, correspondence between medieval scholars and ecclesiastical leaders, and even records of secret orders that claim to be protectors of this heritage. During the Inquisition, any association between Mary Magdalene and feminine spiritual power was harshly repressed. Women who claimed to have visions or channelings of her figure were tortured, burned, or silenced. The Church, during that period, further reinforced the image of the repentant sinner as a way to nullify any trace of leadership or sacredness attributed to Magdalene. The construction of this image was not innocent, it was strategic. By rewriting Mary's story, the role of women in spirituality was also rewritten. And with this, an exclusively patriarchal system was consolidated, where the sacred feminine was replaced by dogmas, and intuition was replaced by obedience. Other manuscripts, kept under the custody of the Vatican, speak of rituals performed by Mary Magdalene in the years following the crucifixion. There are reports of journeys to Gaul, modern-day France, where she would have continued her mission, gathering disciples and founding schools of spiritual mysteries. These texts, of Gnostic and Celtic origin, describe encounters between Magdalene and tribal leaders, moments of deep meditation, and healings attributed to her presence. Fragments of these stories have survived in the popular traditions of southern France, especially in the region of Provence, where even today there are caves and shrines dedicated to her. The Vatican is aware of these traditions but has never officially recognized them. On the contrary, it has sought to suppress any attempt to worship Mary Magdalene as a central figure. In records from the Middle Ages, there are reports of Templar knights who revered the figure of Mary Magdalene with reverence almost equivalent to that of Jesus. Some texts mention that the Templars protected secret gospels that extolled her role as the bearer of true Christian wisdom. These documents, according to rumors, were captured during the fall of the order, and part of them was sent to the secret archives of the Vatican. They are texts in ancient Latin, sealed with Templar symbols, which mention not only Mary as Jesus' wife, but also as an instructor of rituals that mixed Jewish, Egyptian, and Celtic elements. This cultural fusion, if revealed, would radically transform the understanding of Christianity. The most disturbing aspect of all this is the realization that this truth has been in front of us all along, but it was veiled by layers of doctrines, manipulated translations, and convenient interpretations. Mary Magdalene, as a symbol, represents the reconnection with the sacred feminine, with intuitive wisdom, with the healing that comes from within and not from external imposition. Her exclusion from the official narrative is not just an act of historical misogyny, but a spiritual amputation. By silencing her voice, they also silence the receptive, sensitive, and profound side of Christian teaching. And in doing so, they transformed faith into a system and love into a dogma. Today, the Vatican Library holds the evidence: manuscripts, letters, gospels, pilgrimage maps, testimonies, and even works of art that confirm this forgotten female presence, but they remain closed to the public. The reason? Simple. Revealing the true story of Mary Magdalene not only rescues a forgotten woman, it rescues an entire spirituality that was suppressed. A spirituality that does not separate, but unites. That does not impose, but invites. That does not dominate, but welcomes. And perhaps that's what scares the most: the power of a woman who should never have been forgotten, but who now, like the truth itself, awaits the moment to re-emerge in all its light. Even before Christianity became a structured doctrine, before there were organized gospels, celebrated masses, or established dogmas, the world was already inhabited by ancestral myths, ancient religions, and complex spiritual traditions that addressed themes such as divine birth, death and resurrection, redemption, miracles, and life after death. The emergence of Christianity did not occur in a vacuum. It was born in a deeply syncretic territory, at the crossroads of cultures, where ideas from the East and West intermingled. The Roman Empire was a melting pot of religions, from Egyptian mysteries to Persian cults, from Hebrew traditions to Greek philosophies. And within this context, many of the elements that we today associate exclusively with Jesus Christ were already present in figures like Horus, Mithras, Dionysus, and Krishna. The Vatican Library possesses documents that not only recognize these similarities, but also explore their origin and intention. Forgotten texts, ancient analyses, and forbidden manuscripts that show clearly that Christianity was shaped with ingredients from many earlier sources. And by hiding this multifaceted origin, the Church created a unique narrative that sustained centuries of unchallenged authority. One of the most striking parallels is between Jesus and Horus, the Egyptian god son of Isis and Osiris. Horus was born of a virgin, in a stable, visited by 3 magi, baptized, tempted in the desert, healed the sick, resurrected the dead, and finally, conquered death after being betrayed. All of this was recorded thousands of years before the birth of Jesus. These similarities are described in Egyptian papyri, translated by European archaeologists in the 19th century, and copies of which, in part, ended up in the Vatican archives. But instead of making them public, these texts were sealed. Why? Because they demonstrate that the narrative of virgin birth and resurrection was already part of humanity's spiritual imagination long before the New Testament. And if these elements are not unique, then their origin is not literal, it's symbolic. And the power of control based on the exclusivity of the narrative is deeply shaken. The figure of Mithra, a Persian god worshipped in Rome before Christianity, also reveals striking parallels. Mithra was born on December 25th, performed miracles, was accompanied by 12 disciples, died and resurrected, and was known as the Light of the World or the Savior. His followers practiced baptism and celebrated a ritual with bread and wine. All these practices were later assimilated by Christianity. There are records of theological debates within the Church itself in the early centuries, questioning to what extent these similarities were coincidence or appropriation. The writings of the Church Fathers tried to justify these influences as satanic imitations prior to the coming of Christ, a desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. But documents preserved in Latin, Greek, and Persian, many of them today under the domain of the Vatican Library, reveal that such influences were deliberately adapted and incorporated, creating a religion that could dialogue with the Roman world and absorb its cults without destroying them. Christianity thus became the sum of many previous beliefs, but this truth was carefully suppressed. We cannot forget the influences of Zoroastrianism, the Persian religion that introduced the duality between good and evil, the figure of the final judgment, the belief in an eschatological savior, and in angels and demons acting on the invisible plane. All these elements were assimilated by Christian theology. Internal Vatican documents written by monks and missionaries who studied in Middle Eastern libraries confirm this influence. There are manuscripts translated from Avestan, the sacred language of Zoroastrianism, that present passages almost identical to Paul's letters. The incorporation of Persian concepts was not a coincidence. It was a construction, a pragmatic adaptation of a new faith in formation that needed to dialogue with the cultural codes of the empire it intended to spiritually conquer. In Egypt, besides Horus, we have the strong presence of the cult of Isis, the Divine Mother, depicted with her son in her arms, an image that would later be almost copied to form the archetype of Mary with the baby Jesus. The earliest representations of the Virgin Mary are identical to those of Isis. They carry the same symbolism, the same maternal gesture, the same body position. This fusion of images is not accidental. It's part of a strategy of conversion and spiritual domination. The Egyptian people, devout for millennia to their deities, would find familiarity in the new Christian cult, and so elements of their beliefs were repackaged and integrated. The Vatican Library possesses Egyptian codices with Christian annotations in the margins, showing the process of adaptation and assimilation between the cults, an explicit example of syncretism. Another notable example is found in the worship of Dionysius, the Greek god of wine, which was celebrated with a ritual of death and rebirth, where wine represented his blood and the faithful participated in a sacred feast. The parallels with the Christian Eucharist are evident. There are Greek philosophical texts that speak of Dionysius as the one who dies and resurrects to save men from madness and suffering. These documents circulated among ancient Christian thinkers and influenced the construction of the sacraments. Records found in Alexandria and later taken to Rome reveal this intellectual exchange, and the Vatican, aware of this, made sure to archive such documents away from public view. The role of Constantine, the Roman emperor who officially recognized Christianity as the religion of the empire, was crucial in this process of merging beliefs. Constantine was not just a politician, he was also a religious strategist. He realized that to unify the empire, it was necessary to create a faith that was broad enough to include elements of popular religions, but rigid enough to maintain control over the followers. The councils were decisive moments when texts were excluded, dogmas were imposed, and syncretic elements were officially recognized. The Vatican Library keeps records of these councils, with accounts of internal debates where certain practices were approved not by divine inspiration but by political convenience. Christian symbolism also reveals pagan roots. The cross, the central symbol of the Christian faith, was already used by earlier cultures as a representation of the world's axis, the connection between heaven and earth. The fish, a symbol of early Christians, was also a symbol of fertility in the religions of Mesopotamia. The halo around the heads of saints and martyrs was used in the iconography of solar gods. These elements were adopted, reconfigured, and presented as original revelations. There are medieval codices that explain this process, where monks describe how to adapt pagan symbols to the new faith, how to reinterpret festivities, and how to purify ancient beliefs so they could serve Christianity. These assimilation manuals still exist, and many of them have never been disclosed. Christian holidays such as Christmas and Easter also carry clearly pagan roots. Christmas, celebrated on December 25th, coincides with the Roman festival of the unconquered sun, the return of light after the winter solstice. Easter has origins in agricultural festivals of renewal and fertility. Even the name Easter in English comes from the pagan goddess Eostre. The Church did not create these dates from nothing. It shaped them from already established rituals, only altering their meanings. The Vatican Library has letters between bishops and popes in the early centuries debating how to integrate these celebrations into the Christian calendar. This integration was done with surgical precision so that the people would not feel a rupture but continuity. A continuity that served the purpose of consolidating the spiritual power of the institution. The result of all this is a religion that presents itself as direct divine revelation, but that carries in its DNA layers upon layers of human, cultural, political, and philosophical influences. Christianity as we know it is a mosaic, a compilation of archetypes, myths, and symbols from ancient civilizations, reformatted to create a faith structure that served both the spirit and the empire. The Vatican knows this truth. It is documented, catalogued, and archived, but it has never been shared with the faithful because the truth, when known in its entirety, does not obey. It liberates. In a subterranean vault sealed by iron doors, guarded by security systems that rival the most sophisticated safes of the modern world, lie over 85 linear kilometers of shelves containing documents that have never been revealed to the public. This place is not a literary fiction or a thriller setting. It exists, it's beneath Vatican City, and it's known as the Vatican Secret Archives. Although, in recent years, its name has been gently changed to the Vatican Apostolic Archives. But the name change doesn't alter the essence. There lie records that could shake the foundations of Christianity, redefine human history, and reveal secrets zealously guarded for centuries. The vastness and depth of this collection is so impressive that, even if full access were granted, it would take decades, if not centuries, to analyze everything stored there. And what is most astonishing is not just the known content, but what has never even been publicly mentioned. Among the most restricted sections are documents classified as of pontifical interest, which means their disclosure relies solely on papal authorization. These files are not accessible even to highly accredited scholars. Some of them were sealed hundreds of years ago and have never been opened since. And what lies hidden in these leather boxes, in these sealed parchments, in these ancient codices, are truths that would not only rewrite religious chapters, but would reveal dark aspects of ecclesiastical politics, secret alliances, alternative doctrines, and accounts that challenge what is today taught as absolute dogma. The Vatican, contrary to what many imagine, is not just a spiritual headquarters. It is also a secular power with embassies, armies, finances, espionage, and one of the oldest and most efficient information services on the planet. The secret archives are, therefore, the hidden heart of this power. Among the most controversial documents ever revealed, there are records of correspondence between ecclesiastical leaders and rulers of empires, discussing strategies to manipulate populations through religion. There are letters that openly discuss how the creation of certain dogmas aimed to contain revolts, discourage critical thinking, and spiritually align the masses with the interests of the throne and the altar. There is, for example, a letter dated from the 4th century between influential bishops and members of the Roman Empire, in which the best way to consolidate the narrative of Christ's resurrection as an unquestionable dogma is debated, not out of faith, but for strategic convenience. This letter, according to internal sources, has never been made available, but is listed in the internal catalogs of the archive. Its content, if disclosed, would dismantle the idea that Christian dogmas were born exclusively from divine inspiration. In addition to political correspondences, the archives conceal ancient prophecies, writings from saints and mystics who had visions of the Church's future, some of which have never been officially recognized. Prophecies about the spiritual collapse of Rome, about popes who would be corrupted by power, about a future revelation that would unite religions into a single cosmic knowledge, revelations that would directly threaten the continuity of the papal authority. Many of these visions were suppressed in their early years, and their authors labeled as heretics or, at best, silenced in remote monasteries. The writings, however, were preserved. They exist. They are there, locked away under the justification that they are not canonical or not recognized by the Church, but their preservation proves that the Vatican knows their value. There are also records of unauthorized miracles, documented cases of spontaneous healing, bilocation, appearances of luminous entities, manipulation of matter, and paranormal phenomena that occurred in convents and churches. Many of these events were witnessed by priests and believers, noted in diaries, and sent to the Vatican for evaluation. However, contrary to what one might imagine, the Church does not celebrate any miracle. It selects which ones are useful for the maintenance of the official faith. The others are suppressed, filed away, quashed. There is an internal catalog with thousands of unexplainable events that have never been thoroughly investigated because they do not fit into the approved theology. There are reports of nuns levitating, of saints conversing with unknown intelligences, of cosmic phenomena occurring in sync with spiritual practices. But all of this has been silenced, because admitting such occurrences would mean opening the doors to a spirituality outside of institutional control. One of the most delicate and never revealed to the public collections is the so-called Index of Contradictory Writings, a list of manuscripts that contain passages or accounts diverging from the accepted content of the canonical Gospels. This includes variations in Jesus' words, alternative descriptions of the crucifixion, dialogues between biblical characters that completely change the context of the narrative. These documents were copied by monks between the 3rd and 6th centuries, and many of them are translations of lost Aramaic and Syriac texts. The Vatican did not destroy them. On the contrary, it kept them, because what is hidden there could undermine the textual coherence of the Bible as we know it, showing that the Gospels were edited, rearranged, and even merged from multiple and conflicting sources would shatter the illusion of the Scripture's infallibility. There are also the files pertaining to documented exorcisms, detailed accounts of possessions that do not conform to traditional Christian theology patterns, but present elements similar to ancient cults, pagan invocations, and contacts with interdimensional intelligences. Many of these cases were investigated by theologians, psychiatrists, and exorcists from the Vatican who left detailed reports. Some of these records describe entities that mention forgotten names from antiquity, languages that are no longer spoken, and symbols that date back to Babylon or Egypt. Instead of being treated as common spiritual phenomena, these events were classified as spiritual anomalies of a secretive nature and filed with maximum restrictions. These documents reveal that perhaps the forces interacting with human spirituality are not as understood as thought, and that there are realities still not recognized by the official religion. Among the most impactful documents are records about lost civilizations. Yes, the Vatican holds maps, explorers' accounts, and ancient correspondences that speak of places now considered mythical, such as Atlantis, Lemuria, or subterranean kingdoms mentioned by Tibetan and mystical Christian traditions. Some of these documents mention temples of wisdom where universal truths were taught even before the formation of current religions. These texts speak of enlightened beings, of spiritual technologies, of divine energy sources that were sealed after the fall of these civilizations. There are indications that Christian missionaries, upon coming into contact with indigenous traditions in America, found similar accounts and sent their observations to Rome. All of this was archived. It was never used as a theological basis, because by confirming these stories, Christianity would be forced to recognize that it is not the beginning, but merely a continuation of something much older. Finally, the secret files also contain testimonies of apostles who were excluded from the official narrative, disciples who lived with Jesus, who wrote about their experiences but whose texts were deemed inconvenient. Some spoke of a much more human Jesus, who smiled, cried, had doubts, meditated, taught with humor and tenderness. Others described him as a master of hidden wisdoms, who taught about the soul, the planes of existence, and reincarnation. These testimonies offer a closer, more real, more accessible Christ, and for that reason, dangerous. Dangerous for those who wish to maintain the distance between the divine and the human. Dangerous for those who wish to control access to the sacred. Dangerous for those who live from the intermediation between God and people. And so, everything remains where it has always been. locked, guarded, stifled by centuries of silence. The Vatican presents itself as the guardian of faith, but it is also the jailer of truth. The never-revealed documents exist. They are there in vaults and corridors that almost no one can access, and their mere existence is, in itself, a confession that the history we have been told is incomplete, and that the truth, the one that can truly set us free, continues to wait, patiently, for the moment to finally be unveiled. Throughout the centuries, humanity has divided knowledge into two seemingly irreconcilable categories: faith and science. One is linked to belief, the sacred, the invisible, and inexplicable. The other is anchored in reason, proof, logic, and experimentation. But what if these two forces, traditionally presented as opposites, were in fact complementary? And what if the manuscripts hidden in the Vatican Library revealed that the miracles described in the life of Jesus and his disciples were not just supernatural mystical events, but manifestations of spiritual and natural laws that we simply do not fully understand yet? This possibility, deeply disturbing to dogma, is one of the most fascinating among the documents locked away in the depths of the Holy See. Texts that suggest that healings, materializations, transfigurations, and other miraculous manifestations may be connected with principles that we are just beginning to explore through quantum physics, neuroscience, and modern cosmology, but that were already understood by ancient wise men with surprising clarity. Among the hidden records, there are codices that narrate in detail spiritual practices taught by Jesus to an inner circle of disciples who were prepared to receive the greater teachings. These texts speak of specific visualizations, rhythmic breathing, conscious use of the word, mental projection, and manipulation of one's own bioenergy. There are reports of out-of-body experiences, of healings performed not by direct imposition of hands, but by the vibrational alteration of the diseased matter. According to these sources, Jesus' miracles were not a violation of the laws of nature, but a superior expression of them. He did not break the rules of reality. He understood these rules at a level that we have not yet reached. This view is reinforced by writings found in the Judean desert, which describe a Jesus who studied the structure of the soul, the flows of creation, and the vibrational language of the universe. Manuscripts like these have never been made public, but they are listed in the Vatican's internal indexes under the seal of primitive Christian Hermeticism. Furthermore, there are texts that suggest Jesus mastered the use of certain natural elements and substances that enhanced altered states of consciousness, broadening spiritual perception and healing abilities. Some of these documents, translated from Greek and Aramaic, mention the ritual use of specific plants, plant extractions, and sacred ointments, prepared according to precise formulas. The practice of anointing, for example, so symbolic in Christian liturgy, originated from these energy activation rituals. This knowledge, deeply aligned with Shamanic and Eastern traditions, was systematically erased. Its reappearance in apocryphal manuscripts reveals that, at the origins of Christianity, there was an applied wisdom, practical, that united body, mind, and spirit as inseparable parts of the divine experience. Another explosive point contained in these texts is the reinterpretation of the concept of reincarnation. Several writings now hidden or discredited, among them fragments attributed to Origen, one of the early theologians of the Church, speak of the soul as an eternal being that undergoes cycles of learning in different lives. There are passages that directly mention the need for spiritual purification over multiple incarnations, and how Jesus would have taught this in more reserved circles. These ideas were present in the early Christian communities, but were eliminated from the 6th century onwards, when the doctrine of reincarnation was officially condemned by the Second Council of Constantinople. Since then, any mention of this topic has been considered heresy, even though there are copies of ancient manuscripts preserved in secret. There are clear indications that the Vatican maintains hidden translations of original documents that link Christ's teachings to the cyclical journey of the soul. The connection between science and faith also appears in writings that describe the use of sound as a spiritual tool. There are records that Jesus used specific intonations, mantras, and sound vibrations that altered emotional states and facilitated healing processes. This type of practice, resonant with Indian and Tibetan traditions, is today studied by science under the name of sound therapy, showing real effects on cells and the nervous system. The Vatican has documents translated from ancient sources that explore the language of creation, a non-verbal but vibrational language, where each word spoken with intention has creative power. This view coincides with the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But the deeper interpretation of this passage, according to these manuscripts, goes beyond symbolism. It is an operative key, a vibrational law of the universe. Speaking with elevated intention would shape reality. Other records point to the existence of mystical experiences induced by practices of fasting, silence, and isolation. There are descriptions of retreats led by Jesus in caves, deserts, and mountains, where he and his disciples experienced visions, encounters with beings of light, and direct communion with the Source. These experiences, treated as hallucinations or exaggerations by traditional theology, are narrated with precision and detail by followers who lived them. Some of these texts describe parallel realities, encounters with superior intelligences, and revelations that anticipate ideas of modern quantum physics, such as multidimensionality, energetic entanglement, and the interconnection of all living beings. These writings, of course, have never been considered official, but they are preserved, hidden, inaccessible. Alchemy, often associated with medieval occultism, also appears in secret archives as part of the ancient Christian spiritual tradition. Some manuscripts preserved in the Vatican speak of inner transmutation as the true philosopher's stone, the transformation of the dense and ignorant being into a being of light and wisdom. There are symbolic formulas, alchemical metaphors, and descriptions of internal rituals that evoke not only the external Christ, but the inner Christ, the divine spark within each human being. This approach, highly liberating, replaces the need for religious intermediation with a personal journey of awakening. It's not surprising that such texts have been suppressed. There are also stunning accounts of mystical experiences with light. Documents describe people who have witnessed Jesus enveloped in radiant brightness, not as a metaphor, but as a real physical manifestation. The Transfiguration on the Mount, for example, is treated in some manuscripts as an energetic phenomenon, where Jesus becomes pure light and communicates telepathically with his disciples. This light, according to these accounts, is the same found in all enlightened beings, and could be activated by anyone who reached a certain level of consciousness. This possibility that the average human being could achieve the mystical states of Jesus completely undermines the doctrine of divine exclusivity. That's why these texts have never been validated, but have been carefully preserved. Some manuscripts also report the use of the body's natural magnetism to influence environments and people. There are detailed descriptions of gestures, postures, and breaths that channeled vital energy, what today would be recognized as practices of Qigong, Reiki, or Pranayama. These methods were not seen as miracles, but as part of the spiritual wisdom accessible to all. According to these texts, Jesus did not want to be venerated. He wanted to be understood and replicated. The teachings he conveyed were often practical, experimental, and accessible, but they required commitment, self-knowledge, and discipline, exactly the opposite of the passive faith promoted over the centuries. Finally, there are texts that suggest the true teachings of Jesus were destined to reveal themselves only when humanity was ready. There are prophetic references to the Age of Light, when the veils would fall, secrets would be unveiled, and science would unite with spirituality, a time when hidden knowledge would cease to be the privilege of priests and would become the heritage of all humanity. These documents speak of cycles, of cosmic eras, and of the arrival of a new planetary spiritual awakening, and that in this time the hidden archives would finally be opened. Perhaps we are approaching this moment. Perhaps that is why the silence of the Vatican is becoming more unsettling each year. Because the more science advances, the closer it gets to what spiritual traditions have always known, and what the secret manuscripts have always protected. That a miracle is just the name we give to the science we still do not understand, and that the sacred is the universe seen with awakened eyes. Since the early centuries of the Christian era, knowledge has always been more than a quest for truth. It has been an instrument of power, and as such, control over this knowledge became a matter of institutional survival for the Church. The Vatican, over 2 millennia, has developed not only a collection of sacred documents, but a true internal network of containment, surveillance, secret management, and information filtering. Behind the golden curtains of liturgical ceremonies and the Pope's public blessings, there is a silent machine formed by theologians, librarians, academics, cardinals, and secret orders, whose mission is to protect what cannot be revealed. These are the guardians of the secret, men and women trained, selected, tested for decades, who live in the shadows of history, not to destroy it, but to ensure that it remains unaltered. And among them, there are those who carry truths capable of destabilizing what the world understands as faith. At the heart of this structure is the Apostolic Archivists' Corps, an intellectual elite of the Church, composed of highly specialized scholars, polyglots, historians, and paleographers who master dead languages such as Classical Latin, Aramaic, Koine Greek, and Coptic. They are the few who are permitted to handle the most sensitive documents of the library and the secret archives. But even among them, access is segmented. Each member can only consult documents related to the theme for which they have been directly authorized. No copies are allowed. No photographs. Notes must be handwritten under constant surveillance. They sign lifetime silence agreements. And a simple breach of conduct, even the slightest, means the immediate end of their career, academic exile, and, in some cases, absolute isolation. The devotion required of these guardians is not just to faith, it is to secrecy. There are also records of popes who tried to break the cycle of silence. John the 23rd, for example, was known for his progressive vision and even authorized the partial disclosure of documents related to the period of the Second World War. Internally, he considered opening part of the ancient Christian archives, especially those related to the councils and the apocryphal Gospels. However, his initiative was quickly stifled by conservative sectors within the Vatican, especially by the hidden arm of the Roman Curia, responsible for preserving institutional integrity. Internal sources suggest that, after his death, orders were issued to block any similar future attempts. Since then, the selection of content to be released has been decided by an ultra-secret commission whose members are not always revealed to the public. This is a structure that operates as a state within the state, with its own rules, hierarchies, and objectives. Among the organizations that act as guardians of silence, Opus Dei stands out, a personal prelature of the Pope, with thousands of members scattered around the world, many of whom hold strategic positions in universities, governments, financial institutions, and, of course, within the Church itself. Although Opus Dei officially presents itself as an organization of lay people devoted to the sanctification of work, in practice, it operates as a network of influence and surveillance. Various scholars assert that part of its members are directly involved in controlling the documents that circulate in the library and the archive. They are responsible for filtering, reviewing, editing, and, if necessary, concealing any content that could jeopardize the doctrinal stability of the Christian faith. Their silent power is so great that, even within the Church, few dare to speak openly about their operations. Another group whose presence is often overlooked in public discussions is the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuit order. Founded in the 16th century, this order has a long academic tradition and is directly involved in the administration of libraries, archives, and Catholic educational institutions. The Jesuits are masters in critical text analysis, and many of the major internal debates about the contents of ancient manuscripts involve their members. There are indications that within the order, there is a core of specialists whose mission is to study the oldest documents in the Vatican Library and propose strategies for their future revelation, or permanent concealment. It's not just about protecting faith, but calculating the political, social, and spiritual impact that each piece of information could cause when exposed to the world. The VatiLeaks case, which took place between 2012 and 2016, gave the world a small glimpse of what happens behind the scenes at the Vatican. Documents leaked by members of the administration itself revealed practices of corruption, internal power struggles, and manipulation of sensitive information. But what few people know is that part of these documents directly mention the existence of manuscripts classified as explosive, texts that could alter the public perception of the foundations of Christianity. These files, according to the leaks, were protected by security protocols involving multiple physical keys, cryptography, biometrics, and papal authorization. The exposure of this data caused an internal earthquake, leading to the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, the first in nearly 600 years to voluntarily abdicate. The scandal was hushed up, but it made one thing clear. Within the Vatican, secrecy is a currency of extremely high value, capable of even toppling the most sacred throne. Reports are not uncommon from scholars who, after coming into contact with unauthorized documents, mysteriously disappeared from public life. Some fell silent out of fear. Others were transferred to distant missions under the pretext of service to the gospel. There are cases of excommunicated professors after publishing studies based on manuscripts whose existence the Church has never confirmed, but also never denied. The Vatican prefers silence to denial, as to deny would be to acknowledge the existence of the documents. Silence, on the other hand, allows for ambiguity, and ambiguity is an effective shield against uncomfortable curiosity. Within this game of shadows, surveillance is not just external. The Vatican keeps detailed records of every library visitor, every request made, every page read. Discrete cameras, motion sensors, biometric identification. Nothing escapes the eyes of the internal overseers. Everything is recorded, analyzed, classified. Scholars are discreetly observed by undercover agents, and their notes are often copied even before they leave the building. This atmosphere of constant control creates a psychological tension that few can endure for long periods. The pressure to maintain silence is constant and subtly coercive. There are also cooperation agreements between the Vatican and intelligence agencies from various countries. The content of some documents, especially those touching on geopolitical themes, is shared with allied governments. There are reports of information exchanges between the Vatican and secret services such as the British MI6, the American CIA, and the Israeli Mossad. The reason? Simple: knowledge is power. And the Vatican's archives contain secrets that pertain not only to faith, but to the history of nations, to pacts between kingdoms, to the origin of conflicts, and to the manipulation of the masses. Keeping this knowledge under control is of global strategic interest. The question that echoes, then, is inevitable. If all this structure was set up to protect these documents, what exactly do they contain? What kind of truth would require this level of containment? This network of silence, this apparatus of intelligence and censorship? The answer, although still locked behind the walls of the Vatican, seems increasingly clear. The manuscripts hold a story different from the one we were told. A story in which Jesus is not the exclusive property of an institution, in which the sacred is accessible to all, in which the feminine has power, in which the soul is eternal and free, in which science and spirituality walk together, and in which fear gives way to truth. These guardians do not just protect documents. They protect a worldview, a way of seeing the world that preserves the control, authority, and structure of a spiritual empire that has dominated consciousness for centuries. But the truth, no matter how well protected it may be, has its own rhythm. And when it is ready to emerge, or when humanity is ready to receive it, no guardian will be able to stop it. Because the truth, like light, cannot be contained forever. For centuries, we've been taught to view spiritual truths as something distant, too sacred to be touched, reserved for saints, theologians, or the clergy. But if there is one powerful revelation that emerges from the hidden manuscripts in the Vatican Library, it's this: spirituality is not a castle surrounded by walls. It's a river that flows within every human being. The concealed texts, suppressed or overlooked, do not just talk about ancient events, sacred characters, or unreachable miracles. They talk about you, about me, about all of us. They speak of a dormant potential that, when awakened, completely transforms the way we live, feel, and relate to the world. And perhaps the greatest secret kept behind the Vatican walls is not just what Jesus did, but what he taught that we all can also do. Imagine for a moment that the truth about divine nature was not an exclusive mystery revealed to a few, but an inner knowledge accessible to all. Imagine that Jesus' miracles, healing the sick, walking on water, transforming reality, were not isolated acts of a unique figure, but demonstrations of universal spiritual laws. Moreover, imagine that he himself said this, taught this, left it recorded in texts, erased from history. Now imagine that these texts still exist, hidden, waiting for the moment when humanity is ready to rediscover them. This moment is not a distant point in the future. It begins now, with every question you allow yourself to ask, each doubt about the narrative that has been imposed on us, each restlessness that leads you to seek more, to go beyond, to reconnect with your deepest origin. The forgotten manuscripts speak of a Jesus who did not want to found a religion, but to awaken consciousness. A master who called God Father, but taught that the kingdom of heaven is within us, not in cathedrals, nor on altars, but in the silence of the heart. He taught to love without measure, to forgive without conditions, to seek the truth even when it topples structures. And it is precisely for this reason that his deepest teachings were silenced. Because they liberate. And anything that liberates is, by nature, dangerous to any system based on control. But now, as these truths emerge with the light of time, we are confronted with a profound choice: to continue repeating old dogmas or to dive into the rediscovery of who we truly are. The transformation these documents bring is not theoretical, it's practical. They show that spirituality is not just belief, it's experience, that we no longer need mediators between us and the divine, that every thought, every emotion, every word has creative power, that we can heal ourselves, transform our reality, transcend destructive patterns, that we are not sinners waiting for redemption, but consciousnesses in the process of awakening. This is the silent revolution that inhabits the veiled pages of the apocryphal Gospels, the Gnostic texts, the Christian Hermetic treatises, the human being as a living temple, the soul as an extension of the eternal, the body as an instrument of light, life as a sacred school. These documents also place in our hands forgotten keys, meditation practices passed down by Jesus to his closest disciples, breathing exercises that elevate the body's frequency, vibrational words capable of reorganizing emotions, acts of compassion that modify the energetic structure of the environment. These are not esoteric promises, but spiritual technologies recorded in ancient scrolls, aligned with modern discoveries in neuroscience and physics. There are mentions of heart coherence, the human magnetic field, the ability to communicate with other dimensions of consciousness, all of this written at times when these words did not yet exist, but wisdom was already pulsating. And there's more. The texts speak of Mary Magdalene as the bearer of profound teachings on conscious love. They talk about reincarnation as a process of soul evolution. They discuss the earth as a living organism interconnected with the heavens. They speak of universal brotherhood among people, the unity of all religions, the possibility of a spirituality without borders, without dogmas, without fear. They talk about a new world, built not with wars or laws, but with understanding, compassion, and inner awakening. They speak of us. They speak of the now. The impact of these documents on modern spirituality is devastating to the foundations of institutionalized religiosity, but profoundly liberating for the individual. They reveal that everything we seek outside, in temples, gurus, rituals, already lives within us. They teach us that salvation is not a place, but a state of consciousness. That hell is not divine punishment, but a mind trapped in fear. That heaven begins when we abandon judgment and choose love, and that the Messiah did not come to be worshipped, but to show a path that everyone can follow. This is the greatest revelation, and for that reason, it is the most feared. But now the veil begins to fall. Humanity, saturated with ready-made answers and failed systems, begins to search for something more authentic, more truthful, more alive. We start to realize that faith doesn't need to be blind, that science can be sacred, that spirituality doesn't need to exclude, but include. The Vatican secret archives, no matter how tightly they remain closed, have already lost part of their power, because truth has a movement of its own, and it begins to emerge on all sides. In independent studies, archaeological findings, intuitive revelations, in the synchronicities of everyday life. It pulses in every human being who dares to ask, What if everything I was taught isn't the full story? This question, simple and powerful, is the gateway to a new reality. A reality where faith is not submission, but expansion. Where knowledge is not forbidden, but celebrated. Where love is not a bargaining chip, but the foundation of being. Where each individual becomes a co-author of their own spiritual journey. And if the guardians of the secret still try to maintain the darkness, it is because they know that awakening is irreversible. Once the soul glimpses the light, it never settles for the shadow. And this light does not come from outside. It comes from within. It comes from you. Perhaps you will never set foot in the corridors of the Vatican Library. Maybe you will never see the locked manuscripts with your own eyes. But that doesn't matter, because the most powerful truth they hold is already in circulation. It's already reaching the hands and hearts of millions, and it's up to you to decide what you will do with it. Will you ignore it? Will you fear it? Or will you awaken? Because in the end, it's not about ancient documents. It's about remembering who you are, and that is the real miracle, the true gospel, the ultimate liberation. The final revelation does not come with lightning in the sky, nor with trumpets on the hills. It arrives silently, like a whisper in the soul. And when you hear it, you know. There's no turning back. Because the truth, once awakened, cannot be imprisoned. And you, free soul, were made to know it, to live it, and more than anything, to spread it. Now tell me, mind unfettered, if you could have access to just one secret manuscript from the Vatican Library, what would you want to discover first? Share it here in the comments. Let's manifest this collective awakening together, because when one mind is set free, it inspires thousands to do the same. This is our sacred space for seeking and expansion, and your voice is part of this journey. What if I told you that Jesus left a hidden map to enlightenment, a step-by-step guide forgotten for centuries? Then don't leave the screen. Click on the next video now. The Book of 33 Steps, the hidden map Jesus left for enlightenment. Because the next step of your consciousness begins now.